Good morning, class. It's Friday morning. We had our Zoom conference yesterday. I'm starting to lose my voice, and so this introductory video to chapters 23 and 24 might be a little bit shorter. We're talking about participles here, and chapter 23 we'll be talking about the imperfective adverbial participles. Imperfective, we're talking about what traditionally would be labeled as present participles. And chapter 24 would be perfective adverbial participles, what usually would be labeled as aorist participles. So let's see what we're talking about. Out of section 23.3, we read this: non-finite forms simply describe an action without telling us who did it, or they apply a verbal description to a noun. And so as we saw in chapter 22 on infinitives, which we would label as verbal nouns, the chapters we were going to look at this week are participles, and we would call them verbal adjectives. In the same way, an infinitive may look at either a noun or a verb and say, "You think you're hot stuff, I can do what you do," maybe even better. Participles do the same thing. Now, at the same time, Decker gives us a caution always to recognize that participles will be subordinate. And so we should always pay attention to the main verb as the important part of a phrase. The participles just add to that. English participles, a hint, they're ing words. Not all ing words in English are participles, but we'll look at these examples. The car sitting in the parking lot has a flat tire. And so the sitting word is the participle, and notice as a verbal adjective, it's telling us something about the car. Which car? The car that is sitting in the parking lot is the one that has a flat tire. Here we've got another one. Leaping to his feet, he hurled the rock. Okay? The leaping there tells us something about the main actor, what he was doing when he threw the rock, okay? Or perhaps right before he threw the rock. Listening to a new song on my phone, I studied for my Greek exam. I don't think that that's probably a wise thing to do, but the word listening tells us something about the person and what the person was doing at the time that he or she studied for the Greek exam. Snarling cats will often scratch. Yeah, I'm allergic to cats. I don't like cats. And the prophet had a fire burning in his bones. Tells us something about the fire. The fire was burning in his bones. So those are ing words, English participles. I know that probably many of you have not actually done sentence diagrams, but Decker gives this kind of a chart, and perhaps we can follow along. The main part of this sentence is the teacher gave a quiz. The participle there would be eating, and of course we've got a temporal marker there, after eating, and so that is going to tell us when it was that the teacher gave the quiz. He was chowing down on a freshly baked pie, and after that, then the teacher gave the quiz. That would be an example of an adverbial participle, because that part that is under the verb gave is telling us when something took place. We've also got this chart, section 23.6. A puppy. Which puppy? The puppy that was chewing on the table leg. What's that puppy got to do? Well, that puppy has to learn. And so the main part of the sentence is the puppy must learn. But the participle, the ing word, is identifying which puppy. It's not the puppy that is sleeping peacefully in his kennel that must learn. No, it is the puppy that is chewing on the table leg must learn. That the chewing is the participle, and it is acting as an adjective, modifying, telling us more about puppy. Greek participles are going to work pretty much the same way. Now, as far as frequency, participles are abundant. There's a section where there are like 3 participles in every 2 verses or something like that. You can see 6,662 total participles in the New Testament. 3,687 of them are present participles, imperfective. 2,289 are perfective. Now, seeing that chart kind of surprised me because I would have thought that there were more aorists than present. That may be significant. Only 673 perfect participles, and there are 13 future participles. So, for whatever that's worth. And if you got your Bible software, you could do your own analysis on the words in the New Testament. Last chapter, chapter 22, I did not include the image that corresponded to infinitives, but some of you are verbal learners, and so I wanted to insert this. You can see the participle is hybrid. It has some of the characteristics of verbs. It has some of the characteristics of adjectives. And so it might look down its nose and say, "How, you think you're tough? I can do what you do. I can do more than what you do." And so if that chart is helpful for you, we can pay attention. Now, Decker is going to use a term in the chart on section 2312 as participle marker. The way I've taught Greek for a lot of years, I have used the term participle morpheme rather than participle marker. But I wanted to show you the participle marker for active participles would be the nutau or ous. Nutau in both the masculine and the neuter, ous in the feminine. And I'm not sure what happened with this. I think I actually put that graphic on top of that. The middle participle marker would be men. That's mu epsilon nu, men. And we'll see this in the chart as you can follow along. This is the chart of the present active participle. And you can see we've got masculine, we've got feminine, and we've got neuter because as a verbal adjective, it will line up and link itself with something else in the sentence, and it will agree in case with that something else. And so we've got 3 genders. We've got nominative singular, genitive singular, dative singular, accusative singular, and then we've got 4 more spots for those same cases. And so you can see in the masculine and neuter that's highlighted there in kind of a bluish tint, everywhere except in the nominative singular and dative plural, you've got that participle form marker of the nutau. And in the feminine, all the way down, you've got that participle marker of the ous. Okay? And so those will be the forms of the participle that you'll have. It's probably helpful to understand that the masculine and the neuter follow third declension patterns as far as the endings. The feminine follows a first declension pattern. So sometimes this chart would be labeled 3-1-3. That is masculine third declension, feminine first declension, and neuter third declension. Pedagogical note, the way I've taught this for years using Bill Mounce's text, he talked about the importance of learning 6 forms. That if you learn the first 6 forms, that is nominative singular from masculine, feminine, neuter, come down to the second column and you get the next 3 forms, genitive singular of the masculine, feminine, and neuter. If you learn those forms, as long as you recognize that the pattern to fill out the entire chart would be a 3-1-3 pattern, if you know your third declension endings and your first declension endings, you ought to be able to fill out the rest of the chart. So this is present active participle of luo, and I would actually rehearse these 6 forms like this. On usa on, ondos uses ondos. And recognizing that 3-1-3 pattern, then I should be able to fill out the rest of the chart all the way through. That's what I have done. I think it's a helpful practice, and so I wanted to share that with you, even though Decker does not mention that anywhere. As far as the present middle passive participle, you can see that participle form marker, or the participle morpheme for middle passive of men. You can see in all 3 columns, you've got omen, you've got your stem, you've got omen, and then you've got an ending. And unlike the active, you can see that this follows what I'd call a 2-1-2 pattern, in that the masculine follows second declension patterns, the feminine will follow first declension patterns, and the neuter also second declension patterns. And so in the same way, I talked about the 6 forms for the present active. You can do the same thing with the middle passive. And so I would rehearse these 6 forms in my head. Nominative, reading across, then coming back to the genitive line and reading across. And so I would practice these endings: omenos, omene, omenon, omenu, omenes, omenu. I can see that middle passive participle form marker or morpheme in there, and that's helpful in identifying exactly what's happening. Now, adverbial uses of participles. This is section 23.20. Now, in chapter 24, you're going to have a larger list. I'm not going to go through that list, but I certainly invite you to pay attention to that. There are only 4 that are listed at this point in chapter 23, and so let's look at those 4. A participle can be causal, okay? Now, I think maybe you can follow along the text in Acts and read that with me. Prophetes un uparchon, elales en perites anastaseos tu Christou. Perhaps the only word there that would cause you a little bit of difficulty is that third word, which is the participle uparchon, and that's a word that talks about existence or being. It's kind of like just the participle that you've seen of imi. It's the on, being. And so Acts 2, 30 and 31 talks about, therefore, being a prophet, existing as a prophet, he spoke about the resurrection of Christ. Because he was a prophet, that's kind of the causal nuance. And these nuances come not hardwired into what a participle is, but they come from context. But one of the nuances that is possible is that of cause. Number 2, the nuance of purpose. John 12:33 says, "Tuto de elegen semenon pio thanato emelen apotheneskin." I think you can follow along with me, but this he was saying. Semenon is a word that means indicating or signing. Pio thanatu, by what kind of death? Emelen apotheneskin, what kind of death he was about to die. So John is saying he was saying this with the purpose of indicating to his followers what kind of death he was about to die. Now, in the context of John 12, this is where we find that wonderful verse of Scripture that says, if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. And then John says, indicating the purpose for which he said such a thing, but he was saying this with the purpose of indicating by what kind of death he was about to die. A participle can also have an adverbial nuance of means. Now, once again, it's not hardwired into the participle. The participle is just a verbal adjective, okay? But context can indicate some of these nuances, means. How about this one? 1 Corinthians 4:12. Kopiomen, that's let us labor, ergazomene, dis ideas hersin. But let us labor by means of working with our own hands. And then the temporal, the time relatedness. Mark 2:14 says, paragon iden levin. This is, and as he was passing by, he saw Levi. Okay, now, in the extreme right-hand corner at the bottom, I have placed 4 lines of things that have been helpful to me. At this point, Decker's given you 4 nuances. There are more. And I remember these nuances because I, much like liquid aorist has no sigma, exclamation point. I remember this. Maybe I wanted to be a cheerleader rather than a basketball player when I was a kid. No, that's not true. I wanted to play ball. But kind of in a cheerleader fashion, I remember this. TMM, triple C, PRAC, okay? Now, these other nuances of the participle are going to be listed in chapter 24. I'm not going to deal with them a lot, but I certainly invite you to pay attention to that. TMM, the T stands for time or temporal. That's covered in this slide. MM would be manner, which is not covered here, but will be in chapter 24. Manner or means. Triple C. We've got on this slide causal. A second C is condition. And a third C would be the idea of concession. And so as I run through this cheer in my head, TMM, triple C, I remember that a participle can have the nuance of time, manner, means, condition, cause, concession. I don't care what order you get those in. PR is purpose, result, and attendant circumstance is the AC. And so I think it would be helpful for you to learn this cheer and to learn the labels that go along with each one of these letters. TMM, triple C, PRAC, time, manner, means, condition, cause, concession, purpose, result, and attendant circumstance. And Decker will treat attendant circumstance in chapter 24. The present participle of imi, we got on, ondos, onti. Notice that is also a 3-1-3 pattern, in that the neuter follows the masculine as a third declension pattern, and the feminine column is first declension. You have seen the on, the masculine, already in your dialogues. And so there's that chart. It is not that difficult if you know your endings for the different declensions. Moving to chapter 24, I'm going to move quickly through this. The aorist active participle of luo. In the aorist, can you see the presence of that sigma alpha? Yeah, that's going to be your sign of the aorist. The presence of the sigma morphologically should indicate aorist, sometimes maybe future, but outside of the indicative, certainly aorist, okay? And notice that we also have the new tau participle form marker there. In the feminine, the us is modified slightly. We've got the sas, okay? We can see that this also is a 3-1-3 pattern. And so the aorist participle is going to work exactly the same way the present participle works. The only difference is that verbal aspect. And as we encounter that in context, we'll probably make some comments about that. Notice the aorist middle participle, because just as in the indicative, there are 3 voice set points in the future and the aorist. In the indicative, we have an active form, we have a separate middle form, and we have a separate passive form. And I've talked to you about how we ought to look at that, not as 3 separate set points, but as a continuum, and things flow along that continuum back and forth as they will. You can see the sigma alpha. You can also see that middle participle morpheme of the men. And so, in the same way, the middle participle is a 2-1-2 pattern. That is, masculine and neuter are second declension patterns. The feminine sticks with that first declension. Then we have the aorist passive, just in the same way that in the indicative, a theta eta was the indication of an aorist passive. That eta is just shortened, and so we have theta epsilon iota there. And we can do the 6 forms along the same way. This is just a pedagogical method. The 6 forms for the aorist passive participle, as I would relate just the endings, nominative across the top, come back to the genitive across from masculine to neuter, thes, thesa, then, thendos, theses, thendos, a 3-1-3 pattern. So if you know those 6 forms, you ought to be able to fill in the rest of the chart. We're more about recognizing of forms when we see them, however, than actually populating a chart. But it's helpful to know those 6 forms, because if you know those 6 forms, when you come down and you find, say, a dative plural, you should be able to recognize that because they follow exactly the same forms. Participle is a verbal adjective. That part of the participle that's like an adjective behaves just like nouns and adjectives that we've seen already. What about second aorists? Okay. This is eilthon. Okay. The second aorist form of erchome in the indicative is eilthon, and it starts with an eta. The eta is a lengthened epsilon, and so that actually is the augment. Participles don't have augments, and so it makes sense that that eta would shorten and become an epsilon. And so we can do the 6 forms across there. Now notice that actually this is going to function a lot like the endings of a present, okay? We'll recognize that when we see them. Second aorist middle, notice we're going to have that men, which is an indication of the middle. A second aorist has a stem change. Now, this is listed on the chart as a second aorist middle of yinome. Now, in BLC, we're spelling yinome not with that gamma iota, but a gamma epsilon iota, but it functions much the same way. And so in the present participle, you will actually see that gamma iota, or the alternate pronunciation and spelling of gamma epsilon iota. However, in the aorist, we've got a stem change. And so we'll recognize an aorist of yinome because we will not see yin, but rather we will see yen. And so you can see all the way through this chart, you've got gamma epsilon nu, which will indicate, hey, we've got a stem change. This is an aorist. Second aorist, passive. Just as we saw in the indicative, a second aorist passive would be what my former colleague and mentor would have called a non-theta aorist passive. And so the example of a verb that takes a second aorist would be strefo. And so as you look at this chart, it's just like the first aorist passive. The only thing that is missing is the theta disappears. And so as you see these endings, is, isa, en, endos, ises, endos, those would be the 6 forms, and you recognize it's a 3-1-3 pattern, you ought to be able to recognize these as we go ahead. So chapter 24.20. This is where Decker is going to give more of the participle nuances, and we're going to fill out this chart. And so what I want to do is just leave with you this cheer, TMM, triple C, PR, AC. And there's a section in this chapter where Decker will talk about attendant circumstance. I find them all over the Gospels, and it makes me happy, okay? But you study the chapter and bring your questions to our group meeting on Thursday. All right? That's what we've got for this section of Decker's grammar. And so I ask that you be diligent, be patient. I'm going to do the very best I can to get my grade system up to date in Canvas. Have a good day. Blessings.